Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? This ain't murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Mark your calendars once more for September 30th, 2018. Ricardo Rodriguez will be sparring with the Laredo Kid. You don't want to miss this one, in case you did miss the last big event. As of right now, the location looks like it will be 820 Gale Street, that's just to the east of McPherson Road, here in Laredo, Texas. This brings it a little farther north, and it should help with the parking. Make plans to attend the wrestling match between Ricardo and the Laredo Kid, September 30th. That's only 51 days away. Believe it or not, it will be here sooner than you expect. Tonight's show was requested by Watcher 1000. I received a message, a few good ideas on shows, and I'm going to do my best to look into all of them. There were a few ideas for shows I had already done. I have 120 shows out, but only 90 of them made it over to YouTube. If you want to hear every show, and I must admit the early ones might not be the best work I've ever done, check them out at strangethings.podomatic.com, where you'll find the entire archives for free. When it comes to living in another world, I think writers have it down pat. Some folks live in a fantasy world, but they keep it to themselves. They go through life acting and looking just like everyone else. Writers not only live in another world, but they invite others to come take a peek inside. I've caught myself thinking about some of my characters as if they might be a bit too real. My wife told me I do act a bit weird when it comes to my story folks. I've actually had to change a story because the character wasn't cooperating. It's more like I couldn't get the character to work out the way I wanted, but still, new character, new book. So many times I've started writing a story only to have to go back and change the beginning so that it would match the middle. It's like, oh shoot, that character died off in the beginning, I better go back and change that. Dean Koontz once said when he starts a book, he has the opening scene and that's about all. He said he's as surprised how the story turns out as we are. I didn't believe him until I got into writing. I'm not trying to compare myself to Dean. I wish I had his talent. I mostly wish I had his paychecks. But I must say, I have no idea how a story is going to end, even as I'm getting close. The stories sometimes write themselves. If you're interested in taking a peek inside my head, may I suggest either Flying Saucers Attack Walmart, or maybe This Sucks. This Sucks is about a guy who becomes a vampire, but he doesn't know what he's doing, so he kind of has to learn it as he goes along. We're not born knowing how to fly. If you suddenly can turn into a bat, that doesn't mean you suddenly know how to fly. And why is it in Hollywood, when a man weighs 150 pounds, turns into a bat, he only weighs 3 pounds? What happened to the other 147 pounds? So, being me, when my character turns into a bat, he still weighs 150 pounds, and he doesn't know how to fly. Of course, that doesn't stop him from trying. Check it out. You can find This Sucks at Amazon.com. Where else? Of course, my favorite story is The Bag Company. That's B-A-G Company. Bogus Anomalous Group. It has grown on me even as I was putting the words down on the pages. And now for the main part of the show. The Voynich Manuscript is an illustrated codex, or book, handwritten in an unknown writing system. Vellum is prepared animal skin, or membrane, used as a material for writing on. The vellum on which the Voynich manuscript is written has been carbon dated to the early 15th century, or about 1404 to 1438. It may have been composed in the northern Italy during the Italian Renaissance. The manuscript is named after Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer who purchased it in 1912. The invention of writing was one of the great advances in civilization. Writing, in fact, helped assure the continuity of civilization because it carries a tangible record of the human race from generation to generation. Before writing, the only way to pass on history was through spoken words. If you've ever played that game, Telephone, you'll know how things get changed as they pass from one person to the next. The earliest writing can be traced to Sumer in Mesopotamia. This system didn't use an alphabet, but instead it used pictographs, which are symbols representing familiar objects. This type of writing was called cuneiform, or wedge-shaped writing. Egyptians used hieroglyphics, also a pictograph system. The use of an alphabet may have originated among the Phoenicians sometime between 17 and 1500 BC. This Semitic writing had only consonants. The ancient Greeks later came up with the idea of vowels. If you don't have a vowel movement, you will become consonanted. No, I'm not a comedian. The Chinese writing system, which is also a very ancient form of writing, maintained its pictograph characters instead of developing an alphabet. This is why the Chinese alphabet has over 3,000 characters. Just imagine what a typewriter must look like. The picture writing had to be phased out by word writing. Words took the place of pictures so the writer could better express him or herself. A picture can tell 1,000 words, but you only want the person looking at it to come up with the exact same idea as you're putting down. Everyone looking at a picture comes up with their own idea as to what the artist was saying. This wouldn't do if you wanted to tell a specific story. Hundreds of signs for thousands of words had to be invented and then learned by students. Plus, everyone had to agree on what a specific word meant. We're fortunate that our alphabet only has 26 letters. I'm still curious why the letter C sounds like an S or a K, depending on how you use it. Why does the Mexican alphabet have a K that is always silent? And why is phonetics not spelled phonetically? Once you had a writing system to work with, you had to come up with something to write on. The Egyptians carved their hieroglyphics into stone. The Sumerians used clay as a writing base, and then they would allow it to dry. Copper was also used by hammering it out into thin sheets and then scribing the letters into the soft metal. The trouble here was the copper sheets had to be rolled up and stored in a safe place so they didn't get smashed flat. Every time you wanted to read the thing, it had to be unrolled and held down flat, and the edges were sharp. Talk about a paper cut. Papyrus was first manufactured in Egypt as far back as the 4th millennium BC. The earliest archaeological evidence of papyrus documents dates from 2560 years to 2550 years BC. In China, instead of writing on papyrus, they used bamboo strips held together with a string. You could lay them out flat and then read the words from top to bottom. A paper was invented in China around the 1st century AD. The discovery of the process using the bark of the blackberry bush is attributed to Cai Lun, but it could be older. Anytime an emperor died, they would sometimes make bizarre decrees like burn every manuscript you can find. Why? Because they said so. This led to a lot of holes in the history of making things, since every so often the entire library had to be rewritten. Texts were reproduced by woodblock printing. The diffusion of Buddhist texts was the main impetus to large-scale production. The format of the book involved with intermediate stages of scrolls folded concertina style. The scrolls bound at one edge were called butterfly books. The first use of paper wasn't for writing. No, paper was used for a far more important task. Toilet paper was invented in China. They had huge sheets that you would fold up and then do what needed doing. Many ancient cultures around the world have independently discovered and formulated ink for the purpose of writing and drawing. The knowledge of ink, the recipes and techniques for the production, comes from archaeological analysis or from the written text itself. Ink was used in ancient Egypt for writing and drawing on papyrus from at least the 26th century BC. As ideas were put down in writing, the pages had to be safeguarded. You could only make a page so big if you wanted to be able to read it without leaning way across the table. The length was only limited by how big a scroll you were willing to have and how much it weighed. If you had a couple of big burly guys to roll and unroll the scroll, you could make it as long as a football field. Then you needed some place to store it. Scrolls couldn't be stacked too high because the ones on the bottom would get compressed and become useless. Ancient libraries had small cubicles lined up along the walls where scrolls could be set while waiting for somebody to come read. I wonder how they found what they were looking for. Up until the Dewey Decimal System came along, you had to memorize the location of just about every document in the library. I'll bet being a librarian back then was quite a job. Although there's no exact date known, between 618 and 907 AD, the period of the Tang Dynasty, the first printing of books started in China. The oldest printed book is a work of the Diamond Sutra and dates back to 868 AD during the Tang Dynasty. The Diamond Sutra was printed by methods of woodblock printing, which is a strenuous method in which the text had to be carved into a wooden surface, essentially to be used to stamp the words onto the writing surface. All the words had to be reversed, so when the print was made, it would be readable. Mirror writing had to be learned by the folks who did the carving. Woodblock printing was a common process for the production of already handwritten texts during the earliest stages of book printing. This method was extremely time-consuming. By the end of antiquity, between the 2nd and 4th century, the scroll was replaced by the codex. The book was no longer a continuous roll, but a collection of sheets attached at the back. it became possible to access the precise point in the text quickly. You no longer had to unroll and roll and unroll and roll the scroll looking for a particular area. You could just flip through the pages. The codex is equally easy to rest on a table, which permits the reader to take notes while he or she is reading. The codex form improved with the separation of words, the capital letters, and punctuation, which permitted people to read far easier. Tables of content and indexes facilitated direct access to information. Say you wanted to look up the earliest UFO report. All you had to do was look on the front page and look for the word UFO, and then you'd go to the corresponding number of pages. This form was so effective that it is still the standard book form over 1,500 years after its first appearance. When folks discovered you could sew a bunch of pages together and put them between two covers, a book could be stood on end and hundreds of them could be stored where only a few scrolls could sit before. In what is known as the Dark Ages, dark as in very few people could read or write, and nobody took a bath, if you wanted to learn, you would have to attend classes at the local monastery. The monks could read and write. This made the ability to read and write either just for the royalty who had the time for such things, or the clergy who had to read and write as a part of their day-to-day lives. The commoners only knew how to do whatever job it was they were going to do for the rest of their lives. You didn't go to school and learn how to do a job. If you wanted to work in a wine press, you would show up at the wine press and you would pretty much volunteer your time until you learned how to do the job. Then that would be your job for the rest of your life. There were no technical schools. There were no books that you could get that would tell you how to do something. You only learned how to do something by doing it. In Europe, the best way to manufacture books was by hand. Monks would sit in a small room, lit by a few candles, at a very small desk. They would have an original book written by a monk who wrote out before them, who had written their book by hand. The new book was handwritten with fancy letters to begin each chapter. The letters were decorated to look more like works of art. The pages were usually vellum, and the monk would carefully print out each word. Since the eraser hadn't been invented yet, if a mistake was made, it had to be scraped off using a knife, and then the correct wording put down. This kind of reminds me of a joke. Now remember, I'm not a comedian. Way back in the Dark Ages, a young man discovered that he was destined to be a monk. So he went off to the monastery and he learned everything there was to know about being a monk. He had decided early on that he wanted to help write books. Which book in particular? Why, the Bible. So he told the priest in charge of the monastery that he wanted to help write the Bible. So the old priest took him into a room filled with other monks, and he showed him this huge pile of already written books. He said, "Now take one of these books that's already been written and sit down over at that desk." The old priest brought the young monk a fresh, clean, unwritten book and set it down in front of him and told him, "Now simply copy everything in the old book into the new one." Oh, the young monk was as happy as could be, sitting there day after day, copying out the Bible so it could be distributed throughout the world. Oh, one day, he made a mistake. He caught it before it had gone too long. He scraped off the improper word and rewrote it. But then he got to thinking, what if I had missed that mistake? What if I had copied that mistake into the next Bible, and the person who used my Bible to copy would make that same mistake. Well, the young monk was so concerned about this problem that he went to the old priest thinking, what if the person before me made a mistake, and I am simply copying that same mistake? When the old priest heard this worry, he told the young monk not to worry at all. He was going to take a fresh written copy of the Bible down into the vault in the basement, and he was going to compare the two. And he was going to make sure that the books that they were writing today were an exact match for the old scrolls. The entire day went by, and the young monk began to worry. He hadn't seen the old priest. He hadn't come out of the basement. The next day, the monk was really worried. What had happened to the priest? After all, he wasn't a young man. What if he died down there in the basement? So the young monk went down into the basement in search of the old priest. He found him sitting in the corner, holding the scroll in one hand and crying. The monk ran to the priest and he said, "Father, what's wrong? What did you find?" And the old priest held up the scroll and he said, "Look, right here it says, 'Celebrate life.'" Like I said, I'm not a comedian, but the word celebrate and celibate, shouldn't have to explain that. Anyway, back to the story. The pages were vellum, and like I said, if you made a mistake, you'd take a sharp knife and you'd scrape the ink off the surface of the skin and then redo the word that you'd made a mistake on. It would take months, sometimes years, to print just one book. As soon as the monk was finished, he would go get a fresh book, and he would start all over again, copying the exact same words. Some books had illustrations added to give the reader something to look at. These were called illuminated texts. Most illustrations were woodblock prints. The picture would be carved into a flat piece of wood in reverse. Ink would be spread on the block and it would be pressed into the blank page. The image would come back out the correct way, providing the carver didn't screw up. Too much or too little ink was also a problem. The very first book of maps had a picture of Atlas holding up the earth. For some unknown reason, every book of maps has been called an atlas since then. Because of the meticulous and time-consuming process that was woodblock printing, B. Sheng, a key contributor to the history of printing, invented the process of movable type printing around 1041 or 1048 AD. Bai Sheng developed a printing process in which written text could be copied with the use of formed character type, the earliest type being made of ceramic or clay. The method of movable type printing would later become somewhat improved by Johann Gutenberg in 1448. Gutenberg did not invent the movable type. That was the Chinese. As more and more books became available, the rich folks and the royalty began to collect books as a show of how wealthy they were. Whether or not they could read wasn't important. They wanted to show off their book collections. This led to a new form of trade, the book salesman. It wasn't like today where you could just go online and order up a complete collection of, say, the Bag Company stories. Someone had to travel about the world looking for books to buy and then sell to all those rich folks collecting. As time marched on, rare books would trade hands and move about the world. Vast collections would be amassed and then sold or traded to other collectors. On more than one occasion, a rich book collector would die and his family would sell off his collection, not knowing its worth. One of the largest libraries in the world was in the Vatican in Rome. Thousands of books, scrolls, documents, and letters were amassed and cared for by those who knew how to handle books. 1801, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Italy. He took the Pope captive and then seized the Vatican Library. As a show of his strength, Napoleon had the entire library loaded onto carts and hauled away to Paris. Orders were handed down from Napoleon to one of his minions, who then told one of the underlings, who then had some men move the books from place to place. The men doing the real work of loading and unloading had no regard for keeping the library in any kind of order. So the books, manuscripts, valuable tomes were all dumped into boxes or trunks and drug away from Italy en route to France. The wagons were pulled along at the fastest rate of the slowest set of oxen. The trip took weeks of travel, combined with stopovers along the way. Any time a wagon broke down, the contents had to be unloaded and then reloaded once the damage had been dealt with. Have you ever tried moving large boxes of books? They are heavy. Once the wagons and carts had arrived in Paris, the books were dumped into the floor of a warehouse. Thousands and thousands of rare, valuable documents were piled up and left. No one bothered to ever try to keep them in any kind of order or condition. In 1817, the warehouse was opened and the piles of books found. A cardinal was sent from Rome to deal with the mess. He selected some books to be sold so they could raise money to return the rest to the Vatican. When it became apparent they weren't raising enough money, documents and books were sold to anyone for any price. Books were torn apart to use the paper for wrapping things being shipped. Scrolls were used to wrap food like bread and fish. No one knows how many valuable one-of-a-kind books might have gone the way of wrapping paper. The books that survived were returned to Rome, and the long, arduous task of sorting and reshelving them began. It is still going on today. This is why now and again a rare book or document will be found in the mess that was once a huge library. The Voynich Manuscript might just have been one of the books taken to Paris and then sold to some unknown book dealer. Voynich was from Poland, and he traveled the world looking for anything in print. He came across a strange-looking book one day in 1912. The cover was hand-tooled leather, but it had no name of author, or for the book, that matter. The bindings were all hand-done as well. Inside, there were hand-drawn illustrations showing all manner of odd scenes. The words had been handwritten and were in a language unknown to Voynich. He bought the book, thinking it had to be rare and it should bring a hefty price. Voynich had obtained the opportunity to acquire a number of valuable manuscripts. Friar Strickland told him about this collection only after Voynich had promised he would keep the origins an absolute secret. Because of this promise, Voynich had to make up a story about the source of these books and manuscripts, so he came up with the claim that he had discovered the collection himself in a chest that the owners themselves didn't know what was in. Inside the trunk was a note written by the Jesuit cataloging the items as being for sale in 1903. Some claim that Voynich wrote this catalog himself to add credence to his cover story. The collection for sale consisted of approximately 380 manuscripts and 30 printed books. Many of the books had been labeled as belonging to a P. Beck's private library, and they originated from the Jesuit Collegium Romanum library. The majority of these books and manuscripts were acquired by Pope Pius X, who had donated them to the Vatican Library in 1912. Now you might wonder how a book that was supposed to be in the Vatican wound up in a trunk being sold to a book dealer. That might be why Voynich had to make up a story to cover what might have been a stolen set of books. Books can cost a lot of money, and a rare book can cost an arm and a leg. You don't hear a lot of stories about book thieves, but they're out there. The very first Bible printed by Gutenberg, which is referred to as the 42-line Bible, or B42, or even the Mazarin Bible, it costs a lot of money. If the owner was willing to sell you this rare book, it would run somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 million. Yes, that's 5 million with an M. But that Bible is cheap by comparison to the Codex Leicester, which is also called the Codex Hammer. That was written by Leonardo da Vinci. If it were for sale, you'd need to come up with $30 million. That's 6 times as much as the Gutenberg Bible. So yes, stealing rare books can be a lucrative business if you can get your hands on the books and then track down a buyer. So Voynich bought or stole or found this rare book in a pile of other books that were worth a lot of money. He then may or may not have added a few notes, pieces of paper claiming that the book belonged at this library or that library, so that he could tell people that he had acquired it in a honest manner. Or he may have gotten it in an honest manner. We don't know. The volume is filled with drawings, and some of the things nobody can explain. The first few pages show illustrations of plants, but nobody is quite sure what all kinds of plants are shown. Some look like common greenery, while others are unknown species. Some of the pages can be folded out, allowing for larger drawings to be viewed. The largest of these consists of 6 pages, all folded together into one. I'm going to take a brief pause here, drink a little coffee and play some commercials. Don't go away, we'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Makeup isn't something you want to just smear on and hope for the best. You might come out looking like Lon Chaney. Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and get a free makeover to see how makeup should be done. 956-723-3019. Coffee makes the world go round, and around here we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Now stop squinting and start seeing. hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. I almost forgot to take a break there, and I was wondering why my throat was starting to get dry. Need coffee. The writing in the Voynich Manuscript was done around the illustrations. This shows that the drawings were done first and the writing put down to accompany the pictures. The illustrations are in color and look as if they were sketched and then color painting in. Then there are some colorful, bizarre patterns with people doing things like taking a bath or just running around naked. It wasn't until the 1700s that people were told they should wash their hands and their faces. Just those parts. It took a while longer before bathing even caught on. Just about every one of the first 100 pages of the Voynich Manuscript have an illustration on it. Some fill the entire page, while others are surrounded with writing. Once the plants had all been drawn and written about, the pictures turned to what appear to be astrological drawings. The different signs of the astrological chart are listed, but they're not in the correct order. These are done in a circle with repeating illustrations in small sections. The writing seems to go along with the illustrations, but in some unknown language. Most everyone who looks at the manuscript assumed it was in someone else's language, but the scholars were hard-pressed to figure out just whose language it was. A few of the pages are missing. There are still 240 remaining. The text is written from left to right, the way they do in Europe. The front and back covers have been replaced. It is believed that the original cover were made from wood, which was then covered with cloth or hide. As the years went by, people would look over the text in the book and try to decipher it. Once all the language had been eliminated, they turned to code-breaking sessions. The people tried to apply every known and a few unknown code deciphering methods, only to come out not understanding any of the writings. The Voynich Manuscript had been studied by many professional as well as amateur cryptographers, including American and British codebreakers from both World War I and World War II. No one has yet been able to decipher the text, and it has become a famous case in the history of cryptography. The mystery and the meaning and the origins of the manuscript have intrigued many who have looked at it. The manuscript has been the subject of quite a few novels as well as a lot of speculation. None of the many theories proposed over the last 100 years has yet been proven to be right. In 1969, the Voynich Manuscript was donated by Hans Krauss to the Yale University Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library. What do we know about the document? It has been carbon dated to being from the early 1400s. The ink is what you would find during that time period. A few pages have been removed by somebody hundreds of years ago. The original cover was replaced, but that was a long time ago as well, and the book has pictures. The scholars say the book is probably some kind of a medical journal dealing with women's ailments. The illustrations are supposed to be of herbs used to treat different female patients. If this is the case, why are so many of the plants unknown species? There is no record of anyone having this book in their library recently. It is guessed that it may have been in several different collections over the years. The first confirmed owner was George Bereshk in 1630s. Bereshk was an obscure alchemist from Prague. He was just as puzzled as scientists today about this weird book that he said was taking up space uselessly in his library for many years. Bereshk sent some of the samples of the book to his friend, a Jesuit scholar, Anthonsius Kircher, hoping he might shed light on the subject. This may have been when a few of the pages were cut from the manuscript. There is no record of Kircher answering the request, but it is known that Kircher tried to buy the Voynich Manuscript. Bereshk refused to sell, thinking if his friend wanted the book, it must be valuable and therefore worth hanging on to. Once Bereshk had died, the manuscript passed to his friend Jan-Marek Marci, who was the rector of Charles University in Prague. A few years later, Marci sent the book to Kircher, his longtime friend and correspondent, so Kircher wound up getting the book without having to pay for it. The book isn't listed in anyone's library after that, but they assume it was a part of the Collegio Romano in Prague. When Victor Emmanuel II of Italy invaded and captured Prague, there's my cat trying to play with the buttons. When Victor Emmanuel II of Italy invaded and captured Prague, he then seized control of anything of value, including their libraries. The folks living in Prague hid some of their books away in private collections, but the Voynich manuscript pretty much vanished from history until it reappeared in 1914. And this is about all we know for sure. The language is still unknown. It is some kind of a code, but that doesn't make sense if all the book is a medical text. If someone was going to write up a medical book on herbal cures, why make it in such an unusual format? The only person who could use the book would have been its writer. In the 1400s, there were many books out showing which plants could be used to treat illnesses. You'd go through so much effort, who would go through so much effort to make a secret text on things that could be found anywhere? Code use has been around for years. Back when every order had to be relayed by hand, a king or general would have to write out his orders and then have a courier ride to the recipient. If the courier fell into enemy hands, the plans would be handed over to the wrong side. Codes were used so that only the folks fighting on the same side would know what the message said. Most codes had to be simple so the recipient could decipher the message quickly and then put the orders into action. Word substitution was a common ploy. Both the sender and receiver had to know what everything meant. This led to the necessity of having a code translation sheet pre-printed and distributed about the proper folks. If the Voynich manuscript is in some kind of a code, where is the decipher sheet? Considering how the entire Vatican library was confiscated and moved to Paris, could the pertaining paper have been placed in the wrong box before transport? Or maybe the all-important translation document was sold to some baker who wrapped his bread in it and sold it to a Parisian. Somewhere out there, there might still be another book written in the same bizarre text as the Voynich manuscript. The illustrations all look like they're European in origin. Some show what look like German castles. Didn't want to talk to them anyway. some look like German castles and others have distinctly European features. The plants, on the other hand, could be from just about anywhere. I've seen the TV shows where someone has come to the conclusion that the Voynich Manuscript was a hoax. The host said someone had printed out the entire book and sold it to some rich guy in a means of making money. Oops. This sounds good, but it would have been a lot of work to sit there day after day drawing all those pictures and scribbling out the text, in the hopes that you just might be able to sell it. I think a hoax might have been a few dozen pages, not hundreds. That and the fact that if it were a successful hoax, why didn't the perpetrator do it again? History is filled with cases of people trying to scam others and doing this over and over until the authorities finally stepped in. In preparing the show, I had to read a lot of documents on other people's theories as to what the Voynich Manuscript is. There are hundreds of sites out there that give dozens of ideas on who wrote the book and why. After digging deep, this is about the only information I found worth repeating. Just about everyone who looks at the Voynich Manuscript has their pet theory as to what the book says. My theory is we don't know, and we won't know until somebody can actually read the thing and tell us what it says. The Voynich Manuscript isn't the only odd book out there. The Codex Seraphinianus was originally published in 1981. It is an illustrated encyclopedia of an imaginary world created by an Italian artist, architect, and industrial designer named Luigi Serafini. He worked on it for 30 months, from 1976 to 1978. The book is 360 pages long and written in a cipher alphabet in a constructed language. Why he wrote such a thing? Why do artists paint the things they do? Just because he wanted to, I think. Henry Joseph Darger, Jr., was born on April 12, 1892. He worked as a hospital custodian in Chicago until his death on April 13, 1973. Now that is just a bit odd. He died the day after his 81st birthday. Henry was a reclusive man. Nobody knows much about him until after his death. Henry's landlord was cleaning out the apartment when he stumbled upon a set of books. This was no small thing. 15,145 pages of closely spaced type with illustrations mixed in. The trilogy was called In the Realms of the Unreal, or The Story of the Vivian Girls. Henry had been writing this series for 43 years while working at the hospital. There were color paintings to go along with the story. Some of the paintings were 30 feet long and painted on both sides. The largest part of the book, The Story of the Vivian Girls, in what is known as the Realm of the Unknown of the Glendeco-Anglininian War Storm caused by the Child Slave Rebellion. Why he picked such a long name, I don't know. It follows the adventures of the daughters of Robert Vivian, the 7 princesses of the Christian nation of Abyenia, who assist the daring rebellion against the child slavery imposed by John Manley and the Glandolinians. The children take up arms in their own defense and are often slain in battle or viciously tortured by the Glandonian overlords. The elaborate mythology includes the setting of a large planet around which the Earth is orbiting as a moon, and a species called the Blengigmenians, or Blengigs for short. Gigantic winged beings with curved horns who occasionally take humans or part human form, even disguising themselves as children. They're usually benevolent, but some Blengians are extremely suspicious of all humans due to the Glendillian atrocities. I had to read that exactly the way it said in the Amazon webpage because it was just too much to try to get down on my own. Darger also wrote Crazy House, which was based on his life. He had spent some time in a state hospital for psychiatric reasons. Wow, and I thought I had written a lot of books. Henry Darger never received any money for his vast amount of writing. It wasn't until after his death that his writing came into the public. His landlords, Nathan and Kyoko Lerner, safeguarded their works and managed to get them published. They used most of the money to further the publicity of Henry as one of our world's most prolific and unknown writers. His artwork is on display at the American Folk Arts Museum in New York. The Voynich Codex is a set of writings in an unknown language. This codex is also referred to as the Voynich Codex. The codex was named after the city of Voynich in western Hungary, which is now Reichnitz, Austria. In 1838, the book was donated to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences by Gustav Batthyny, a Hungarian count, along with his entire library. The origin of the book is unknown. It has been listed as being a Hungarian prayer book, but anyone trying to read it would know this is not right. The codex was studied by Hungarian scholar Ferenc Toldai around 1840, and later Paul Hunfalvey. Neither of them could make any sense out of the text. The book was then examined by the Austrian paleography expert Dr. Moll, who also went away shaking his head and wondering what the book was supposed to be. Joseph Jarek and his son Konstantin, both university professors in Prague, studied 32 pages of the Codex in 1884 and 85 without learning anything. In 1885, the Codex was also sent to a German researcher, a professor in Innsbruck University, but he was not able to decipher it. Some scholars began to say that the Codex was a hoax written by Samuel Nemes, who was born in 1796 in Transylvania, Hungary. In 2000, Benedict Lang wrote an article about the Codex. He argued that the Codex was not a hoax. Instead, it is a concisely encoded and encrypted text. It may be a cipher or a shorthand system of writing. It could also be an artificial language. Some of y'all might know this, but they have a book out that is a word-for-word translation from some of the characters on Star Trek. The Klingons had their own language that was just a few words muttered by the crew on the show now and then. Well, somebody actually sat down and translated their entire language from English to Klingon or from Klingon to English. So there are people out there that will do that sort of thing. Once more, until someone finds the code to unlock the secrets held in this book, no one will ever know for sure. It just would not be a show about weird books without including the following character. Michel de Nostradame was born on either the 14th or the 21st of December, 1503. The date of his birth is different depending on who you ask. His family had been Jewish, but they had changed to the Catholic belief before his birth. He started out by entering college hoping to study medicine, but after the first year he had to leave due to an outbreak of plague. The entire college was shut down by this. Nostradamus began working as an apothecary, or a pharmacist, until the plague had run its course. During this time, he may have come up with a cure for the Black Death, because many of his patients survived, including his first wife. Nostradamus then re-entered the college and continued his studies, only to be expelled when the staff discovered that Nostradamus had actually worked for a living. His time as an apothecary was considered manual labor and therefore unacceptable for their high and mighty standards. If you worked with your hands, you weren't supposed to use your brain, I guess. A second outbreak of the plague came about, and this time his first wife and his 2 children were killed in 1534. Nostradamus worked alongside the very doctors he was not allowed to become, trying to conquer the plague. He married his second wife, Anne Ponsarde, who then bore him 6 children. Nostradamus wrote an almanac from the year 1550, and because of its success, he continued writing them for the future years as he began working as an astrologer for various wealthy patrons. Catherine de' Medici became one of his foremost supporters. His Les Prophéties, published in 1555, relied heavily on historical and literary precedents and initially received mixed reception. Nostradamus began to dabble into the occult. He used what is known as scrying. To do this, you needed a darkened room, not too dark. You sit in a chair with a bowl of water in the middle of a table. You look across the surface of the water and you try to pick out reflected images. The images might become as clear as a TV set or as vague as smoke, depending on how good you are and how long you work at it. Some scryers use a mirror and glance across the reflective surface. You're not focusing on the image in the glass, but the images in the distance. It helps if you let your eyes kind of go out of focus. The big question is, are the images in the reflection, or are they more inside your mind? Either way, this is a form of prediction. In France, as well as all of Europe, the Inquisition was still going on. The Inquisition began in 1250. It was a tool used to weed out heretics from the Catholic Church. As time went on, the scope of their efforts broadened out to include just about anything not approved of by scared and superstitious people. Soon, anyone thought to be a witch, a sorcerer, a fortune-teller, or just plain different was drugged before the Inquisition and tortured until they confessed. The term, to put their feet to the fire, isn't just an expression. The torturers would tie a person to a table, and then they would place a burning torch close to their feet. The feet would literally slowly burn off. Talk about ouchie. Most people were more than happy to confess to anything just to get away from the torturers. The last Inquisition trial was held in Spain in 1826. Nostradamus didn't much like the idea of being invited to visit the Inquisition torturers, so he wrote his predictions in code. This code is known as quatrains. Nostradamus is credited with predicting all manner of historical events. He told about a man named Hister who would rule all of Germany, and his reign would be very bloody. Nostradamus also said 3 brothers would be born who would be world leaders. but only 2 of them would actually rule. John and Robert Kennedy did make it into what can be said as ruling positions as the President and the Attorney General. Who was the 3rd brother? Joseph Kennedy, the oldest brother, was killed in World War II while flying a B-17 bomber. The problem most folks have when trying to decipher Nostradamus' writings is, to begin with, he spoke ancient French. The language changed a lot after his life. Then a lot of words were in German or Latin, depending on what he was being said. He used words with similar meaning to throw off anybody from the Inquisition who might delve into his writings. Nostradamus died July 2nd, 1566. Today we have to rely on scholars who can decipher from Old French into modern English, along with the codes used and the unusual meanings of words. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Tell your friends what they've been missing. If you want to find the archives, simply go to strangethings.podomatic.com, and you can write to me at strangethings@arkanasa.com if you've got any suggestions for future shows. Till next time, this is Chris James with Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that I've been hearing, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?